All right, most recently we have learned about the Civil War, which of course is the 4-year grueling war that went on between the northern states and the southern states over the issue of slavery. And today we're going to be talking about the time period just after the war, which is called Reconstruction. And that's a period where people had to rebuild. And they had to rebuild in several different ways. So, of course, physically, properties and buildings and stuff were damaged from these battles. But we also need to understand that there were social types of relationships that needed to be rebuilded because, and we'll go into that in a little bit. And then politically as well, we had some major issues with states that had removed themselves from the United States and now wanted to be added back in. And then what I meant by socially, of course, is people who had been slaves were now freed. And so kind of re-entering the world in a new social way was a huge adjustment for all people. Okay, so our objectives for today are to describe the impact of Reconstruction on Texas and also describe challenges that African Americans faced following the Civil War. All right, we briefly touched on the 13th Amendment last week, but I just want to remind you that after the war ended, the 13th Amendment is what officially outlawed slavery throughout the United States. So on June 19th of 1865, General Gordon Granger finally arrived in Galveston, Texas. And the reason I say finally is that there were some other states where the people who had been enslaved already knew that they were freed. And for whatever reason, Texas was a little bit late to let everybody know that. And so it took General Gordon Granger coming from the Union all the way down to Texas and kind of delivering that message to everyone in Texas for all of those enslaved Texans to know that they were finally free under United States law. Okay, 1 year later, African Americans celebrated the anniversary of this great news. This holiday is known as Juneteenth, which is obviously a combination of the word June and 19th. Okay, so we've combined those two together. And this is a celebration of the day slaves in Texas learned that they were free.
June 19th is more than just another date on the calendar, especially to Black Americans. June 19th, 1865, or Juneteenth, represents something momentous.
What Juneteenth represents is sort of a period that's put in the end of the slavery.
That's Frank Smith. He's the founding director of the African American Civil War Memorial and Museum in Washington, D.C.
But this is a major thing on the part of the United States. For the first time now, it's abolishing slavery. 3.9 million blacks are freed.
So, how did Juneteenth come to be? Well, on January 1st, 1863, as America was in the midst of a civil war in which slavery was a major factor in the conflict, then President Abraham Lincoln issued an executive order called the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared that
all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are henceforward and forever shall be free.
However, it had its limitations, including the fact that it only applied to states that had seceded, leaving slavery unchanged in border states. But the promise of freedom for black slaves, it came with a price.
Came with a provision that you had to join the army and help the Union win the war. Otherwise, the thing would have had no effect at all.
That meant, for the first time since 1792, black soldiers could fight for the U.S. Army.
Well, they had to prove to themselves, but they also had to prove to the rest of America that freedom was important enough to them, so they were willing to risk their lives and to take up, as Denzel Washington says in the movie Glory, to catch a bullet just like everybody else for freedom.
The Civil War continued until April of 1865, when the South surrendered to the North. But during the war, and especially after the war, there were a lot of slaves that didn't know about the proclamation or their freedom. One of those places was in Texas. Then, on June 19th, 1865, more than a month after the Civil War ended, and 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, to inform black slaves that
the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, that's a proclamation, all slaves are free. This involves absolute equality of personal rights.
And although slavery was officially abolished in the U.S. on December 6, 1865, June 19th, or Juneteenth, symbolizes the beginning of liberation.
Okay, so just to kind of clarify, at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, some people who had been enslaved were aware of this executive order by the president. And if they learned that they were free, they did have to join the Union Army, which was an awesome thing to them because they were willing to prove themselves and fight for their own freedom. Okay, but there were other states like Texas where those people who had been enslaved weren't even aware of that proclamation from the president. And so it did take 2 years later for them to even learn that proclamation or order had been put in place. Okay, as kind of continuing on for rebuilding Texas. Not only did the war cause property damage, but Texas's economy had suffered in major ways as a result of the war. Texans had to rebuild their businesses, and landowners and newly freed African Americans had to learn new ways of life. Okay, ending slavery changed the South politically, socially, and economically. To help with these changes, the federal government created the Freedmen's Bureau, and this bureau gave newly freed African Americans food, clothes, homes, access to education, and helped them to find work. This kind of intent of this program was to help everybody adjust to these new changes regarding the economy. Okay, so kind of where most formerly enslaved people found work was as sharecroppers. And sharecropping is someone who's a farmer who rents land from a landowner and then pays that landowner through the crops that they produce. So a landowner would rent out the land to a farmer, loan the farmer tools and seeds in return, and the farmer would pay the landowner with a share of their crops. Okay, one issue with this kind of system or this job is that if the rain didn't come or the soil wasn't fertile enough, and a farmer had a poor kind of season of their crops, it was really hard for them to pay their dues to the landowner, and they would go into debt, meaning they owe money. All right, and now kind of several times we have talked about Texas. They want to join the United States. They want to get rid of secede from the United States or exit the United States. And now here we are after the Civil War, and Texas wants to rejoin the United States again. So Reconstruction meant rebuilding states politically too. All of the 11 Confederate states had to officially rejoin the United States. Each state had to write a new constitution and create a new state government. In 1868, a constitutional convention met in Texas. 10 out of its 90 delegates were African American. The new Constitution gave all adult males, including African American males, the right to vote, and African American men also gained the right to hold office for the first time ever in Texas. The new government also had to vote on the new amendments that were made to the United States Constitution, meaning they had to agree to those amendments or laws that had been made at the federal level. Okay, and so what that meant was Texas was agreeing to end slavery and protect the rights of former slaves and all African Americans. Finally, Texas could rejoin the United States.